So yeah, today's topic is thinking about how we strategize, I guess, in the next phase of the pandemic. Because the next phase won't be like the last phase, or already isn't like the last phase. And when we kind of look across markets and look across the world, we're entering into a period which is much, much more ambiguous. It's going to be longer. It doesn't have a specific end time or an end date. We may be entering or re-entering lockdown. We may be given freedoms, and then those freedoms are going to have to be constrained again. Yeah, which puts a unique set of psychological pressures, I think, on people, and obviously on economies as well. So how do we think about that? Because I guess up to this point, we have been, and this is by necessity, in react mode. Okay, so when we're advising clients, or in fact looking at our own business at the start of this pandemic, it was all about how do we actually defend our business? How do we keep our cash reserves in place? How do we reconfigure our business to work in a new kind of reality? The information that we're giving to our clients has been extremely reactive as well. We want to give them data on media inflation rates in relatively real time. We actually want to give them information on media consumption patterns happening in relatively real time. So the world becomes a very, very short-term world. And obviously us as individuals as well, definitely at the start of our experience of this pandemic, everybody locked to their screens looking at news and looking at statistical data. So we've been in react. And I think that's also reflected in communications too. In a sense, sometimes they've been necessarily reactive. A couple of examples here, probably from the first 8 weeks of the crisis. On the left-hand side, this is a communication from Colombia, which is about telling you to stay at home. On the right-hand side, the example from a retailer who's purely communicating the fact that they've taken health and safety messages. In many ways, communications this early phase of the crisis have become quite flat, either factual or flat as in very stereotypical and one-dimensional in terms of the emotions that they convey. Now, obviously, we're on Teams. I suggest if you have access to YouTube, search for this video, which is every COVID-19 commercial is exactly the same, because it really does bring home. I guess you're not going to be able to hear the soundtrack, but this has got very sad piano music, and it brings to your mind exactly how stereotypical, in fact, a lot of the communications in the crisis have been. They've been sad, they've been mournful, they've been about kind of collective strength. Lots of empty spaces, as you'll see. It goes on. There's been lots of bits about families. Unprecedented is a word that's used continuously. Home's been used continuously. The classic Zoom split frame Teams thing has been used continuously. And everybody's here for you, right? So with the collective impression that you get out, that is kind of wallpaper. It's sort of soft, emotional beige, as all of the advertisers have responded or believe they're responding to us in an empathetic way, but actually what they're doing is they're responding to us in a very, very superficial way. So we've got two kinds of communications coming out in the COVID crisis. One, which is extremely factual, almost like public information from brands, and the other, which is hugely sentimental and often very stereotypical. And I think we've got to move beyond that, really, and that if we don't move beyond that, we're missing a huge opportunity. Let me just move on to the next slide. So this is a piece of research that was conducted in Scandinavia by our colleagues, but I think it's also reflective of a lot of research that's going on at the moment. Obviously, we know that probably consumers aren't just calling out for public information and sentimentality, and I guess this research backs that up. So really, they're asking consumers, what degree do you disagree or agree about the following statements about advertising in the current situation? And actually, one of the strongest results is that people that believe that advertising should be promoting positive perspectives and optimism, should be uplifting. Yes, it should be adjusted to people's needs, but we'll come on to what those needs are. And possibly advertising should communicate in the same way as it always has. Advertising is always sought to entertain or to create an emotional response because we know that's most effective. And perhaps we need to actually be going back to thinking in that way as we enter into what could be a very long phase. Okay, my first little model that might be useful for thinking about this, as anyone knows, I'm very interested in systems thinking, and this is one of the typical models you see in that, is that at the moment, it talks about how we respond to kind of information, how we use information. So on the left-hand side, you've got events, patterns, structures, and models. So if you imagine the most superficial data is events, we're getting that in kind of real time. But really what we now need to start thinking about is what the patterns and what the structures that come out underneath that. So we need to stop reacting simply to very superficial data, but we need to think about what's going on behind it. Because when we're looking at Google search data, often I think in this previous phase, we've been responding to it in quite a superficial, obvious way. So as we move into this protracted period of living in an altered world, we need to think about the more deeper, enduring human insights that lie beneath that reactive data. And we need to also acknowledge that there are very different responses to the same stimuli in different groups in our populations. One second model I'm going to talk about here, which might be useful for you to think about, comes from some time ago. I used to use this model in working with brands to think about what motivations brands were tapping into. So there's a Dr. Stephen Wright, eminent psychologist, American psychologist, working from the 70s and the 80s, did a big piece of cross-cultural research, 6,000 respondents across 4 continents, and he defined what he called the 16 fundamental human drives, that basically the basic desires, goals and motivations which are common to all of us, but which in different individuals are prioritized in different ways, and more importantly, at different times in different contexts. So you'll see everything from motivations which are about being powerful, about leadership. You'll see motivations which are about curiosity and pursuing information and the truth. You'll see basic desires around fairness, around family. But all of these, the priority of these drives actually changes by context. And again, it's a useful thing to think about which of these drives are coming to the fore in the people that you want to speak to, and how does your brand actually align to some of those different drives. Again, it's really worth looking at his work because it's interesting stuff and very useful way of codifying deeper human drives or emotions, and then start to think of them in context of what's changing in people's world at the moment. Another reference point about thinking about how we align our communications more accurately to what's really motivating people is The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. It's an excellent book. I recommend that you buy it and read it. It talks about how we retain or are most affected by experiences that don't just happen on a minute-by-minute basis that average out, but basically the peaks and what they call the pits and the transitions in our lives. They're the moments where we tend to experience things and retain and have greater emotional impact to these moments. And frankly, at the moment, we are going through a massive, powerful moment where we are seeing both peaks and pits and transitions. And we can plan our communications to align to those moments. So Josh was talking about the relevance challenge. If we think more about those peaks, pits and transitions and the role that our brand has to play in them, we can start to think about actually building more empathetic and effective communications. Because we're going through this together. We might not all be experiencing or responding to that stimuli in the same way, but we are going through it at the same time. A 17-year-old who's just had his exams cancelled this year is probably having the summer of their lifetime. Somebody with a young family or with vulnerable parents is probably experiencing an extremely continuing anxious experience, right? But actually, what we do know is we're all going through that transition at the same time. So that is a big opportunity for us. So I'm just going to name check a few examples of bits of communication that have popped out at the moment, which probably actually do acknowledge that a little bit more and acknowledge some of those drives a little bit more effectively. I really did like, actually, in terms of functional retailer, that Carrefour acknowledged the fact that maybe people were staying away from their stores because they feared the density, the number of people that were going to be in those stores, and that's what was giving people anxiety, that they would have to queue for a long time or they would have to be in contact with people for too long. And so Carrefour in Turkey came up with quite an elegant solution, which is essentially a way that you could go and look for your chosen Carrefour. You could scan and you could actually find out what the current traffic flow in the store was, and you could get a perspective of whether it was right for you to visit different times of the day. And again, as we come into a phase where there's going to be a group of the population who are operating in a much higher level of anxiety, how can brands help to eliminate some of that distress or manage some of that distress and make them feel that they're in control of their environment a little bit more? This is a really interesting one. Tranquility. I could just call this nostalgia. It's about comfort. And actually, one of the trends that definitely we've seen in communications around the world is a real movement towards looking backwards. And again, it's about something looking back and consuming content from an earlier time that reminds you of a less anxious, more comfortable period. And there's lots of examples. I'll start with one here, which is in India, classic Indian TV based on Indian myths. They were rerunning this stuff. It became so spectacularly popular that, in fact, they created their own channel segment for it, and it has been the most popular programming in India. It's not just in India, however. Netflix in Turkey, reruns of Prison Break and How I Met Your Mother are actually topping the charts. And even on Spotify, playlists which are angled to retro music have grown spectacularly. So there's a lot of people going back to the 80s for comfort and the 90s for comfort. And I think that's, again, it's a really interesting, it's not simply that they can't produce programming, it's people actually really, really do feel that they want to be kind of cocooned by the familiar. Idealism, I think, again, actions rather than words. And I think this is a lovely piece of work from eBay in the UK, who decided that rather than do the cliche of we're here for you, and all of that guff that you saw earlier on, this is an idea created by Mediacom, who said, actually, no, what we're going to do is we're going to take eBay's marketing budget. What if you gave it to the small businesses that you represent? So you're going to walk the walk and use your marketing budget to advertise the guys who are using your platform to drive their businesses. And again, it's that sense of collective, working collectively, working as a community, but doing it in a way that's real and demonstrable rather than just superficial. I like this one again because obviously people. This is for Audi in Australia. I'm not going to show the whole thing because it goes on for hours and hours and hours. It's a 4-hour long. I'm just going to start it and talk over it. It's a 4-hour long piece of communication, and again, almost as anyone will know, when you're in lockdown, one of the things you kind of most crave for is to look at TV shows and content of places where you're not. Horizons which are bigger than the view that you can see out of your window. And I think it's very clever that Audi, especially in Australia, which is a land of immense thrives and open spaces, created this 4-hour long film, which is just a car driving through the landscape. And it's kind of beautifully relaxing and, again, counterintuitive, but on the other hand, extremely perceptive as well. Penultimate one here. Again, Turkey, one of the biggest collective emotional collective impacts on the population, particularly in big sporting countries, is the closure of sport. And in Turkey, which is an absolutely football obsessed nation, that's had an enormous depressing kind of blow on a huge part of the population. So again, Adidas, working with FIFA, constructed a virtual cup involving Turkish celebrities, all the top Turkish footballers as well, competing in a league, viewable online as a piece of entertainment. Again, it was a very clever way of actually taking something which was an emotional blow and turning it into something positive and active for the brand, as well as actually doing it with speed and agility as well. And lastly, Josh just mentioned this when we were talking about retailers and what I think is interesting about Burger King is that actually, again, rather than adopting the cliche sad face, Burger King takes its personality into the crisis, which is actually, you know, in a way treating it with humor. On the left-hand side, this is at the start of the quarantine in France. These are instructions about how you can build your own Whopper at home. So they're actually advertising other people's products, how you can buy your own bread rolls, cut your own onions, how you can buy some beef burgers, and mayonnaise. And on the right-hand side, obviously, it's a spin on adapting the crown to be socially distancing. So you've got a 1.5 meter space between those two people. So again, thinking about the brand that could play, the role that a brand could play in somebody's life during a period when they have this need. So that's my very short presentation on being more human, and a cry for us to kind of move beyond the sentiment and superficiality of the first phase to really think about how brands start connecting again. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. There's going to be a couple of questions. I think it's really interesting. I think for me to sum it up, from what I heard and from what I've seen, is that reacting in a really cliched way just makes you look really generic as a brand. The thing that I really like about those examples is they're all quite focused on tapping into one specific human motivation or emotion that's happening throughout that time. So I think that's a really good learning for a brand, to be really singular, like the Burger King example, on their current brand and the way that they treat themselves, but having that kind of empathy and emotion with the current situation, I think is where really successful brands have been.
I agree.
Good.